In the winter of 1867, a Norwegian fishing vessel called the Hvitfugl, which translates, almost too perfectly, as the White Bird, departed the port of Bergen with a crew of 11 men and a full hold of supplies for a 6-week North Sea run. 3 days into the voyage, the ship's first mate recorded in the log that a large white swan had been observed following the vessel at a distance, matching its course for nearly 4 hours before disappearing into fog. The captain, according to the same log, ordered the crew below deck. He did not want them to see it. He did not want them to count it. He did not want anyone to say the word out loud. The Hvitfugl did not return to Bergen. No wreckage was ever found. The log entry about the swan was the last notation ever made. Now, before you decide whether that story belongs in a history of maritime tragedy or a history of superstition, hold that question. Because by the end of this video, you may find that the line between those two categories is considerably less clear than you assumed. We are going to talk about one of the oldest, most geographically widespread, and least discussed pieces of animal mythology in human history, the belief, shared independently across Norse, Celtic, Slavic, Greek, Roman, and East Asian maritime cultures, that the white swan was not a bird of peace and grace, but a harbinger, a messenger from a world that sailors desperately did not want to hear from. And here is the part that nobody talks about. Some of those beliefs were not superstition. Some of them were observation. Let's start at the beginning. Not the beginning of the mythology, the beginning of why swans and sailors ever intersected at all. Whooper swans, Buick swans, and mute swans are all migratory species whose flyways cut directly across the major maritime corridors of the North Atlantic, the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, and the Northern Pacific. Sailors operating these routes for thousands of years before systematic weather recording existed were not watching the sky with barometers and satellite data. They were watching animals. Bird behavior was the most reliable meteorological instrument available to a medieval mariner, and they read it with a precision and a seriousness that we have entirely lost. The observation that underpins most of the Swanism tradition is this: swans appear in coastal and offshore maritime zones in specific conditions. They are pushed off their normal inland and estuarine routes by pressure system changes, rapidly falling barometric pressure, the kind that precedes the most violent North Sea and North Atlantic storm systems, drives waterfowl including swans into unusual flight patterns and unusual locations. A swan spotted far offshore, following a vessel, or flying low over open water in late autumn was, in the accumulated practical experience of generations of sailors, a correlate of incoming severe weather. Not a cause. A correlate. An environmental signal that these men had learned, over centuries of watching and dying, to associate with catastrophic outcomes. The mythology grew around the observation the way mythology always does, by expanding a genuine pattern into a universal rule, by personalizing a natural phenomenon into an intentional one, by giving the signal an agency it does not possess but that the human brain is neurologically designed to assign. We are pattern recognition animals. We find intention everywhere. And when the pattern keeps saving lives, or failing to save them, the intention becomes sacred. This is the most important thing to understand about ancient maritime superstition. Almost none of it was random. Almost all of it was data, expressed in the only language available to cultures that had not yet developed the conceptual vocabulary of meteorology, atmospheric science, or migration ecology, the language of omen, curse, and divine warning. But here is the question I want you to sit with as we go deeper into this. When a belief system encodes genuine environmental information in supernatural language, when the curse is actually a weather warning, does that make the belief wrong? Does accuracy of outcome redeem inaccuracy of mechanism? Leave your answer below, because I think this is one of those questions where the most interesting responses come from people who started with a confident answer and changed their mind halfway through typing it. The Norse tradition gives us some of the richest and most specific material. In Old Norse cosmology, swans occupied an extraordinary position. The Norns, the three beings who weave the threads of fate, equivalent in function to the Greek fates, were believed to take swan form when traveling between worlds. The swan was not merely associated with fate. The swan was, in specific mythological contexts, fate made visible. When a sailor saw a white swan on open water, he was not seeing a bird. He was potentially seeing one of the three weavers of his own death or survival, manifested in a form that could exist in both the living world and the realm beyond it. The Valkyries, those fierce feminine figures who chose the slain on the battlefield, were also described in multiple Eddic texts as swan maidens, capable of transformation between human and bird form. Their swan skins, when removed, left them stranded in mortal reality. The swan feathercloak appears in at least 11 distinct Old Norse texts as a boundary object, something that exists simultaneously in two states of being, two worlds, two conditions of existence. The symbolic logic here is not arbitrary. Swans migrate. They disappear and return. They exist on the boundary between water and air, between two environments that humans occupy separately but that swans navigate freely. In a mythological vocabulary built around boundary crossing, the swan is the perfect symbol because it genuinely, observably, crosses boundaries. Celtic maritime traditions developed their swan mythology along parallel but distinct lines. In Irish mythology, the Children of Lear, one of the oldest and most culturally embedded stories in the Irish canon, tells of 4 children transformed into swans by a jealous stepmother, condemned to spend 900 years on the waters of Ireland and the Sea of Moyle, the treacherous strait between Ireland and Scotland. This is not incidental geography. The Sea of Moyle is one of the most dangerous stretches of water in the North Atlantic, notorious among Irish and Scottish sailors for unpredictable tidal patterns and sudden violent weather. Placing cursed, liminal, transformed beings specifically on that body of water was not decoration. It was a way of encoding the emotional reality of that crossing, the sense that the Sea of Moyle was a place where the rules of the normal world did not fully apply. Irish sailors who encountered swans on the Sea of Moyle crossing, which, for the same atmospheric reasons we discussed earlier, they periodically did, were encountering a bird species on a body of water that their entire cultural inheritance told them was inhabited by cursed, sorrowful, transformed humans. The emotional response to that encounter, the unease, the dread, the impulse to turn around, was not irrational. It was culturally conditioned signal processing, built on a foundation of genuine navigational danger. Here is something I find endlessly fascinating about this, and I want to know if you feel the same way. The cultures that built these beliefs didn't have our vocabulary. They couldn't say rapidly falling barometric pressure or anomalous bird displacement due to approaching low-pressure system. But they needed to transmit the same information. Danger is coming, the sea is turning, something is wrong with the conditions ahead. They used the tools they had. And those tools worked. The sailors who heeded the swan omen and turned back may not have understood atmospheric physics, but they were alive. The ones who dismissed it because it was just a bird, we don't have their logs, because they didn't come back to write them. Think about what that means for how we evaluate the intelligence of people who came before us. The Greek and Roman traditions add another layer entirely, because in the Mediterranean maritime context, the swan carried a dual signal, both ominous and prophetic in a different sense. The swan song tradition, the belief that swans sing once, magnificently, at the moment of their own death, was recorded by Aelian, Pliny the Elder, and Aristotle, among others. This is biologically incorrect, as we now know. Mute swans are nearly voiceless, and the whooper swans that do vocalize do not produce their most elaborate calls at death. But the belief persisted and spread across the entire Mediterranean world for centuries, and it did so because it encoded something emotionally true, that some of the most significant communication happens at the end, that the most important message is sometimes the last one. For sailors, who operated in an environment where last messages, final log entries, final sightings, final signals, were operationally critical, the image of an animal that saves its most important utterance for the moment of death resonated with a particular force. The swan that followed your ship was not just an omen of weather. It might be delivering a final warning. One last signal before the kind of silence that swallows ships whole. Slavic maritime and river trading traditions, and we should remember that the major Slavic civilizations were built along river systems that functioned as trade and travel corridors as much as any sea lane, developed a related but darker set of beliefs. In Russian and Ukrainian folklore, the lebed, or swan, was specifically associated with the souls of young women who had died by drowning. The swan on the water was not just an omen. It was potentially a ghost. A soul that could not leave the water because of how it had died, still moving across the surface of the element that had taken it, still visible to those who crossed the same water. The practical function of this belief is not hard to find. Drowning was the most common cause of death in river trading communities. Associating swans, which do genuinely appear in specific locations on specific waterways with some predictability, with the presence of dangerous currents or underwater hazards was a way of mapping risk onto a living, visible signal. If the swan is there, be careful. Not because the swan is a ghost, but because the swan is in a location where the water has already killed people, and may again. I want to ask you something directly. We live in an era of GPS, barometric apps, satellite weather imaging, and automated distress beacons. We have extracted the environmental information from the Swan and encoded it in machines. But here is what the machines cannot do. They cannot make you feel the dread that a sailor in 1400 felt watching a white bird follow his ship into fog. They cannot make the warning emotionally real in the way that mythology makes things emotionally real. And emotional reality, visceral, immediate, unforgettable fear, is often more motivating than correct information delivered calmly on a screen. Does that mean mythology was a more effective warning system for its context than we give it credit for? I really want to know what you think. There is a final element to all of this that brings us back to the Fitfugel, the Norwegian vessel that disappeared in 1867 with a Swan following in its wake. We don't know what happened to those 11 men. We don't know whether the weather was the cause, or human error, or mechanical failure, or something else entirely. What we do know is that the captain tried to protect his crew from seeing the Swan. Not because he was ignorant, because he understood what his tradition had encoded in that image, and he understood that his men needed to function, needed to work, needed not to be paralyzed by dread in the middle of the North Sea. He was managing information. He was protecting psychological resilience under threat. He was doing, in his own way, exactly what a modern crisis manager does when they control the flow of alarming data to a team that needs to remain operational. The superstition was the mechanism. The function was entirely rational. The white swan on open water was never just a bird. It was thousands of years of accumulated human experience, translated into feathers and silence, following ships into the fog to deliver a message that most of us have completely forgotten how to read. Maybe we should learn it again. Tell me in the comments, which of these traditions surprised you most? And more importantly, do you think we've lost something by replacing mythology with meteorology? Because I don't think the answer is as obvious as it first appears, and I suspect the comment section on this one is going to be extraordinary. The next video continues this thread into something even older and stranger. You won't want to skip it.